This is lecture 31 in the ABCs of Communism series. My name's Jason Smith. The text for this will be in chapter 48 of next year's edition of the ABCs of Communism. That is the one that will be Bolshevism 2016. That'll be available in 4 months. Now, today what we're going to talk about is the next country in Central America, which is also part of what's sometimes called the Northern Triangle of Central America, meaning that area between the northern border of Nicaragua and the southern border of Mexico. Now, as you know, because you've been watching these, I've had quite a bit of political experience in Mexico and Guatemala, and quite a bit of industrial experience in the sense of having run an oilfield service operation down there in Mexico, and that was right on the Guatemalan border frequently as well. So I was able to give you some insights into that. With regard to personal experience in Honduras, there are, first of all, 2 components to Honduras: Spanish Honduras and British Honduras, the latter of which we call now Belize, or Belize. Now, that is an area I've had quite a bit of experience in, and we'll get to that toward the end of this particular lecture. Most of this time I'm going to talk to you about what's now the Republic of Honduras, which traditionally was called Spanish Honduras. This is a country that borders to the west of Guatemala and to the southwest of El Salvador. To the southeast, it's bordered by Nicaragua, and to the very south by the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Fonseca, and to the north by the Gulf of Honduras, a large inlet of the Caribbean Sea. It is today a U.S. colony for practical purposes, and it has been a colony of either Mexico, the pre-Mexican state Aztec realm, or at other times of other colonial countries, especially Great Britain, and so it has gone off and on in its colonial status, and at the moment, since the U.S. CIA overthrew the democratically elected government of Manuel Zelaya a few years ago, it has returned to its constituency as part of the U.S. empire, directly administered for practical purposes by Washington. And this has been such a successful coup for the CIA that now Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world, and is one of the 3 most poverty-stricken countries in the world as well, following Haiti. So these are some of the contributions that U.S. imperialism has made most recently in Honduras. We're going to get to its modern history in a minute, but what I want to do here is to lay the foundation for understanding that Honduras as a country has a long history in the colonial period and a long history of primitive communism, and then evolution toward state society, and involved its own state societies, eventually subsumed by the Aztec Empire. And so we want to run through that a little bit, because it's important for you to understand that the process of sociocultural evolution in the New World is a universal process, and every time we look at any one of the Latin American countries, you're going to see it evolving from a primitive communist base, and then through the stage of broad spectrum hunting and gathering, and then to tribal agriculture, finally into simple chiefdoms. Simple chiefdoms always eventually become advanced theocratic chiefdoms, and those in turn eventually class differentiate. That is, the ranks differentiate themselves into true classes, and the state, that is the army and police, emerge in the hands of the financially most powerful classes. So we're going to do that same pattern here with regard to Honduras. Honduras, as I say, was home to several important Mesoamerican cultures, most notably those of the Mayas, which we have discussed before in Chapter 30 on Mexico and Chapter 47 on Guatemala. This land was conquered by Spanish Ronin in the 1500s as part of their conquest of New Spain. The Spanish introduced Roman Catholicism. In its Mesoamericanized version, that became the official religion. And that Catholicism varies from different parts of the world in terms of its structure, and in the case of Latin America, it always takes on some kind of local color, and in Mesoamericanized version is that. Today, Honduras claims Spanish as its official language, but there are many indigenous languages spoken by the Native American populations, and we'll go over that as we get to them. Honduras became independent of Spain in 1821, and since then it has been a republic, although it has consistently endured much social strife and political instability. Today, as I say, it is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, and it has the highest murder rate in the world, largely because of the murderous CIA-imposed imperialist regimes. Honduras spans an area of about 113,000 square kilometers, with a population somewhat in excess of 8 million. Its northern portions are part of the Western Caribbean zone, as reflected in the area's demographics and culture. But Honduras is known best for its rich natural resources, including many minerals, but especially coffee, tropical fruit, and sugarcane, and as well for its growing textile industry, which serves the international market, and of course, as you might imagine, is run by imperialist corporations from the U.S., with sub-local comprador bosses taking advantage of labor that they pay less than $1 a day. Environment, natural and social geography of Honduras is something that is fascinating. You want to visit this place if you ever get a chance, because in many ways it's an extraordinarily beautiful place in terms of its natural environment. Its social geography leaves a great deal to be desired, as you might imagine, because almost everybody there lives in poverty, except for a very tiny group of Creole bosses, that is, Spaniards born in the New World without any direct connection to Spain, and of course the U.S. bosses for United Fruit Company primarily today, or which now is called Chiquita Brands International. At any rate, in terms of its geography, it consists mainly of mountains, with a narrow range of plains along the coasts and a large undeveloped lowland jungle that is occupied by the Mosquito Indians and is called La Mosquitia in the northeast, and the heavily populated lowland Sula Valley in the northwest in La Mosquitia, where, well, in La Mosquitia we have a heavily populated area where the UNESCO calls it a World Heritage Site, and it has the Rio Plátano Biosphere Reserve with the Coco River, which divides Honduras from Nicaragua. When we were talking about Nicaragua, you'll remember I mentioned to the fact that when the Nicaraguan rebels were getting started, they had to retreat into Honduras as a base area, and then as they'd get a little stronger, when they built up finally a firefighting team of 20-odd men, they crossed back into Nicaragua, and then they would fight directly with the army of Somoza at that time. Now, there's a couple of little points I thought I'd make here in addition to that one about the Honduran-Nicaraguan border. The other is that there are a couple of islands that are all owned by Honduras or part of its territory, called the islands of Bahia and the Swan Islands off of Honduras's north coast, and off of the Misterioso Bank and the Rosario Bank north of the Swan Islands that fall within the extended environmental zone of Honduras. Now, the Swan Islands first came to my attention in the 1961 invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Now, I was still in Italy in U.S. Army intelligence at the time, but I learned then that the CIA was using Swan Island, the major one, as its communication center for organizing the invading Gusano forces and their own ships and planes against the Feudalistas on Playa Heron, that is the beach that the invaders were landing at. So I had a kind of an interest in it afterwards, and I found out that George H.W. Bush was the owner of this particular island, and he had turned it over to the CIA to be used in this invasion. Another reason that my attention was drawn to this particular fascist thug from the United States early on. As we go along in these lectures, or if you've read any of my books, you'll find that my path and that of George H.W. Bush crossed frequently over the next years. Well, at any rate, the natural resources for Honduras include a number of things which you may not be aware of, including timber, and but most importantly, gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, iron, and antimony, coal, but fish, shrimp, and hydropower as well. So that doesn't even include all of the fruit plantations, and that Honduras has become famous for as one of the colonies of the United Fruit Company, or Chiquita Brands International, in the Northern Triangle of Central America. So in that sense, the dominant corporate factor there is the United Fruit Company, or Chiquita Brands, in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The next lecture we'll talk more about El Salvador. Well, the climate varies, as you might imagine, from tropical in the lowlands to temperate in the mountains, so in that sense it's exactly the same as the mountainous regions of Yucatan, around Palenque, for example, or the mountainous regions of Guatemala. The central and southern regions of Honduras are relatively hotter and less humid than the northern coast. The ecology there is very similar to that which we reviewed in Guatemala, and that is that they have a huge, the herpetology alone is fascinating. That is, the reptiles and amphibians. There are over 250 species of them, and 7 different species of sea turtles come up to Honduran beaches in order to lay their eggs. There are more than 700 bird species there that have been identified, and of course, as you might imagine, these are highly colorful. 110 mammalian species, about half of those are bats, different species of bats. Well, at any rate, it has 6,000 or more species of vascular plants. About 630 so far described are orchids. So this place is extremely colorful. It's dangerous too. If you're walking through these forests, you never know, and a giant centipede or huge spiders may fall on you from someplace up in one of these high trees, or I don't particularly enjoy it, but if you could be sitting in a bar someplace looking out over a valley, having a margarita or whatever, you could see these orchids are unbelievably beautiful. Well, in the northeastern region of the La Mosquito region, we have the Rio Platano Biosphere Reserve, a lowland rainforest, which, as I think I said, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1982. Honduras has, of course, the rainforest and the cloud forest, which can rise to nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, mangrove swamps, savannas, and mountain ranges with pine and oak trees in between, and a Mesoamerican barrier reef system. In the Bay Islands, there are bottlenose dolphins, manta rays, parrotfish, schools of blue tang, and whale shark. These reefs are particularly tourist attractions in Belize, which is British Honduras. Well, at any rate, deforestation resulting from logging has been especially rampant in the Olancha department, and becoming more so since corporations are moving in since the U.S. coup against Manuel Zelaya a few years ago. The clearing of land for agriculture has become especially prevalent in the largely undeveloped La Mosquito region, causing land degradation and soil erosion, and that, combined with drug trafficking, has pretty well destroyed, for the Mosquito people, that part of the country. Mining activities pollute Lake Yohoa with heavy metals, which is Honduras' largest source of fresh water. So there's another little contribution of U.S. imperialism to the way of life of the Hondurans. And all of these rivers and streams have been polluted to one degree or another, without exception, by uncontrolled mining. Well, now let's go back and take a look at the primitive communist period. And as an archaeologist, I divide the history of Mesoamerica into 8 stages. The lithic stage, which begins 40 to 20,000 years ago and extends at least to the proto-archaic stage of 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, followed by the archaic stage, then the formative tribal agricultural stage, the formative simple chiefdom stage, and I haven't given you any particular dates in here. I may put some in there before the text arrives next year, but the reason I haven't done that is because I haven't found good dating on what archaeological sites appear to have zones that go to those stages. But we do know that those stages do occur in that sequence. Then sixthly, we have an advanced theocratic chiefdom stage, which is also known archaeologically as the PreClassic period, that extends from 1800 BC to 250 BC. That's followed by the Classic period of the early slave stage from 250 BC to AD 900, and the PostClassic slave stage from AD 900 to AD 1500, which we can think of as the later slave stage. And that, of course, is cut short, depending on what part of Honduras you are in, by the arrival of the Spanish Ronin and their feudal stage. And I'll just remind you one more time that the feudal stage in the New World is somewhat different than it was in Europe, in the sense that in Europe you have feudalism that features de facto slavery in Russia and Eastern Europe. On the other hand, as you're moving westward, feudalism takes on a more democratic nature as far as the masses are concerned. There are a variety of reasons for that. By the time these Spanish Ronin got to the New World, they were encountering slave stage peoples, and they had been allowed to enslave non-Spanish people by the Pope. And so the characteristics of Spanish feudalism are that in the New World are that it features de facto slavery of most of the New World peoples rather than holding them as serfs, at least in its initial few hundred years. Well, the lithic period spans the period from the arrival of the first humans in the region to the establishment of broad spectrum exploitation and in the proto-archaic stage, and it is followed by a stage of wild resource management, which is called the archaic stage, and finally with the emergence of tribal agriculture with artifacts of groundstone, pottery, and features such as permanent settlements. And in Mesoamerica, the termination of this phase varies from country to country. We won't worry about it too much for the now. Now, formative simple chiefdoms emerged out of tribal agriculture, and you'll recall that these are essentially tribes, except that they now have a chief with advisors, which I think of as consigliori, and the chief circulates the goods and services that are produced by the different farming families. Eventually, this has internal contradictions, which we've discussed before several times in this series, which require the emergence of some kind of unifying force, which always turns out to be a religion. In the case of Mesoamerica, it's always the Olmec religion, and it's spread from its centers in Mexico, what's now Mexico proper, into Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and as we're going to see, into El Salvador as well. And that was the PreClassic Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom stage, which runs from about 3800 BC to about AD 200. During the PreClassic period, we see the rise of these advanced theocratic chiefdoms with large-scale ceremonial agriculture, writings, architecture, writing, cities, and de facto polities, that is, political units, without, however, clear classes. So what you have here is society differentiating into people with different accesses to the means of production, but not dramatically so. The justification for all of this is that the center, that is the chief and her consigliori, need more authority to be given to them so that they can manage the economy. In order to get that authority, and since they don't have an army or police force to back them up, what they use is religion, and so they have a new rank of priests and priestesses, which are important, and of course they're essentially just like priests and priestesses in any society, just tricksters who keep the masses in line. And I've already described to you many of the different tricks they used on these poor farmers in Central America and Mexico, and the same thing was going on in Honduras. And so here we have, in this period, the introduction of irrigation, corn agriculture, the building of pyramids, and most importantly, the Olmec religious motifs, which are everywhere around this monumental architecture, the calendar, the introduction of human sacrifice, and especially jaguar worship. These are all things that were important in the Olmec religion. The Olmec advanced theocratic chiefdoms developed and flourished, as you've seen, in such sites in Mexico as La Venta and San Lorenzo. In the pyramids outside of Mexico City, many of you will have seen when you've traveled there, the Teotihuacan advanced theocratic chiefdom became a class-divided state, or class-divided state organized slave state society in the Valley of Mexico. The same thing happened in the Valley of Oaxaca. To the Zapotec civilization emerged. The Mayan culture of Yucatan was broad in geographic extent, and it featured the rise of the Zapotec ATCs. These Zapotec ATCs became slave stage, class-divided, state-organized civilizations that eventually brought the entire Isthmus of Tehuantepec under their sway, and then that means all of the northern triangle of contemporary Central America below that is south of the Tehuantepec Isthmus, and that includes the modern Mexican state of Chiapas, and later this expanded from the Yucatan Peninsula through Guatemala and into much of Honduras. So you're beginning to see the cultural unity of this particular area. Let's take a closer look at the Classic era, was dominated by numerous independent city-states in the Mayan region, and that also featured the beginnings of political unity, as we've seen in central Mexico and the Yucatan. Regional differences between the cultures grew more manifest. The city-state of Teotihuacan, for example, dominated the Valley of Mexico until the very early 700 ADs, hundreds of years before the Aztecs had even left North America, that left the United States for this area. But we know little of the political structure of the region because the Teotihuacaneros left only a few glyphic records. The city-state of Monte Alban dominated the Valley of Oaxaca until the late Classic, leaving limited records in their mostly undeciphered script. Highly sophisticated arts such as the stucco work, architecture, sculptural reliefs, mural painting, pottery, and lapidary developed and spread during this Classic era. In the Maya region, numerous city-states such as Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, Uxmal, Cova, Caracol reached their zenith. Each of these polities was generally independent, although they often formed alliances and sometimes became vassal states of each other. The main conflict during this period was between Tikal and Calakmul, who fought a series of wars over the course of more than 500 years. Each of these primitive slave states declined during the terminal Classic, and each was eventually abandoned. Now finally, in the post-Classic era of 1000 to 169 AD, 1690 AD, in the post-Classic era, many of the great nations and cities of the Classic era collapsed, although some continued, such as Oaxaca, Cholula, and the Maya of Yucatan, and at Chichen Itza and Uxmal. This is sometimes seen as a period of increased chaos and warfare. It's always seen as a period of increased chaos and warfare. The post-Classic was a time of technological advancement in architecture, engineering, and weaponry. Metallurgy was introduced about 800 AD in the form of jewelry and some tools, with new alloys and techniques being developed in Central America over the next few centuries. The post-Classic saw rapid movement and growth of population, especially in Central America, Mexico, and in Central America after 1200 AD. It was the period of class and state government fully extant. For instance, in Yucatan, dual rulership replaced the advanced theocratic governments of Classic times. and or joint oligarchy family rule, similar to the ancient Roman Senate that operated in much of central Mexico and Central America. As this dual rulership was very reminiscent of what Rome looked like at certain periods in its early development. The wealthy Pozteca merchant clans and military ranks became true social classes. The Toltec, for a time, dominated central Mexico in the 11th to the 13th century and then collapsed. You'll recall it's from there that Quetzalcoatl had led his army after it was defeated into the Yucatan, and we never heard from them again, where apparently they started an entirely new existence, and that has yet to be figured out archaeologically. The northern Maya were for a time united under Mayapan, and Oaxaca was briefly united by Mixtec rulers in the 11th to 12th centuries, and the exact same thing happened throughout Central America at exactly the same time. The Aztec Empire arose in the early 1400s from mercenary soldier clans who were on the path to asserting class-state dominance over the Valley of Mexico. As such, they continued the evolutionary path of their socio-cultural forerunners at Teotihuacan. Spain sent by accident the first Europeans to contact Mesoamerica, as we have reviewed several times. These Ronin enlisted native allies. Having put paid to the Aztecs, the Ronin next invaded Central America proper via Guatemala and what's now Guatemala and Honduras. By the 1400s, the Mayan revival in Yucatan and southern Guatemala and the flourishing of Aztec imperialism, if you want to call it that is the empire building of the Aztec slave stage, brought along with its fine arts and sciences, and examples include the Puebla Mexica style in pottery, codex elimination, codexes are books, and gold work, the flourishing of the Nahuatl language and poetry, and the botanical institutes established by the Aztec elite. The post-classic slave stage continued until the conquest of the last independent native state of Mesoamerica, which is in Central America, called Tayasal, and that wasn't completed by the Spaniards until 1697. So that's almost 200 years after their initial conquest of Tenochtitlan, that is Mexico City. With that event, the imposition of Ronin feudalism on Central America was completed. And as I say, this is a kind of feudalism that was more Russian feudalism in the sense that the serfs were outright slaves. The dominant state within Honduras' border was that of Copan. Copan fell with the other lowland centers during the conflagrations of the Terminal Classic during the 800s AD. The Maya of this civilization survived in western Honduras, however, as the Chorti people, being isolated somewhat from their Choltean linguistic peers in western Honduras. Other early slave stage states are found throughout the country. Archaeologists have studied sites such as Naco and La Sierra in the Naco Valley, Los Naranjos on Lake Yohoa, Yaramela in the Comayagua Valley, La Ceiba, and Salitron Viejo, both now under the Cajon Dam Reservoir, Saline Farm and Cuyamel in the Aguan Valley, Cerro Palenque, Travesia, Scuruste, Ticamaya, Despoloncal in the Ulua River Valley, among others. In your book, you'll have some maps that will help you locate these if you're interested. Now, let's take a look at what Spanish feudalism brought to Central America beginning in 1524, when, on his fourth and final voyage to the New World in 1502, Cristobal Colon had landed near the modern town of Trujillo. Trujillo is near the Guaybareto Lagoon, and Colon had become the first European to visit the Bay Islands on the coast of Honduras. On the 30th of July, 1502, Columbus sent his brother, Bartolo Colon, to explore the islands. There, Bartolo Colon encountered a Mayan trading vessel from the Yucatan, carrying well-dressed Maya and a rich cargo. Bartolo's men stole whatever cargo they wanted and kidnapped the ship's elderly captain, forcing him to serve as an interpreter. This is the first recorded encounter between the Spanish and the Maya in Guatemala. Of course, as you will recall, that captain from Castile, Grijalva, was the first Spanish Ronin captain who had set sail from Cuba, and he had met other Mayans in his first voyage. It was Grijalva returning to Cuba after this contact that inspired Hernan Cortez to form his investor Ronin force, and then to meet the Mayan kingdoms in battle at the mouth of what is now the Grijalva River. That being the first invasion of the Mexican mainland of the Cortez expedition, which would eventually conquer the City of Gold, Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City. And as I've mentioned to you before, Mel Gibson's movie Apocalypto shows this event, that is the landing of Grijalva and his men, in its closing scenes perfectly. In 1524, the Spanish arrived in Honduras again now, this time led by Hernan Cortez himself, and this time bringing his recently victorious forces down from Mexico through what is now Guatemala. Much of their conquest was done in the following 2 decades. Initially, Cortez turned over power to 2 different groups, those loyal to Cristobal de Olid and those loyal to Francisco Montejo. However, the conquistadors that left their most particular mark were the Alvarado brothers that Cortez had earlier sent to what is now Guatemala. In addition to Spanish resources, these conquerors relied heavily on armed forces from Mexico, Tlaxcalans, and newly recruited Mexica armies from the Zapotec region, of thousands of soldiers. These interlopers into Honduras took control of what's now Honduras and lived on in the region, where they became mercenary garrisons of the new Creole ruling families, again Creoles being Spaniards born in the New World with little or no interest in ever going back to Iberia. And now they have permanent garrisons of these soldiers that originally Cortez had recruited from Tlaxcala and the Zapotec region as their force to back up their rule over the locals. Resistance to Ronin and then Creole conquest was led in particular by the Mosquito advanced theocratic chiefdoms. You'll recall when we discussed Nicaragua that the entire eastern half of Nicaragua is a swamp inhabited by Mosquito people and the advanced theocratic chieftain variety, who never did really fall under any kind of foreign rule until the very end of the 1900s. They were able to maintain their independence. And the Mosquito coast of Honduras never fell to any variety of Spaniards. And the entire Mosquito coast from Nicaragua northward along the Caribbean coast stayed independent of any Spanish rule for centuries. Now, in Spanish Honduras proper, from 1524 to 1821, we have 3 centuries now of Spanish rule, which I'm going to go over but in the book, but for our purposes, I think the thing you want to remember is that nothing much changes over those 3 centuries. And that was pretty well true throughout the Spanish New World. Once these Ronin became indigenous Creole rulers, they settled into latifundias and ran these self-contained haciendas that we call latifundias on slave labor, and ran mines on slave labor and everything else. And they pretty well lived out their lives there, occasionally perhaps sending their kids to Spain to find a husband or a wife, or somewhere in Europe, but not even that so much as the centuries passed, because they had created cities in the New World which had everything in them that the Old World Iberian cities had, or for that matter anywhere in Europe, which remained a kind of a primitive outpost of Eurasia until the advent of capitalism proper. Spanish Honduras, at any rate, began as an organized province of the Kingdom of Guatemala. As a Guatemalan province, the capital was fixed first at Trujillo on the Atlantic coast, and later at Comayagua. Finally, the capital was moved to the center of Honduras, where it remains today at the city of Tegucigalpa. Silver mining was the single most important profit center for both the Ronin conquest and the following Creole rule for the 300 years of the Spanish Empire in Honduras, 300 years of its stability. Initially, the mines were worked by local people through the Spanish slave feudal encomiendas system. The second most important economic endeavor on these slave plantations was sugarcane, for the production of rum to ship to Europe, and for exotic to Europeans anyway, fruits and vegetables. As slavery, disease, and armed resistance from the Mosquito peoples and others that were fighting for their other indigenous peoples fighting for their freedom and independence from the Spanish rule, as that slavery, disease, and armed resistance made such labor less available, new slaves had to be imported from other parts of Central America. And even that was insufficient, as New World slavery tended to destroy workers as fast as they were brought in. So African slaves, mostly from Angola, were obtained, burned up, and replaced by still more from Africa. The local slave trading period worked on its way through the populations of Central America and did not end until about 1600. So for about 200 years, it took about 200 years to wipe out the enslaved population of most of Central America. After about 1650, very few slaves or other outside workers arrived in Honduras from anywhere except Africa. Although the Spanish conquered the Pacific portion of Honduras fairly quickly, they were far less successful on the Atlantic side because of the successful Mosquito Indian resistance. However, they did manage to found a few towns along the coast, such as Puerto Caballos and Trujillo in particular. But as I say, they failed to conquer the eastern portion of that region, so that many pockets of indigenous people remained independent, raising families from generation to generation for centuries without having to submit to Spanish rule. Most important among these were the Mosquito Kingdom, located in the northeast. It was particularly effective in resisting conquest. The Mosquitoes, in turn, found foreign support from the northern European pirates from Nassau and the European privateers from the British colony of Jamaica. In time, the United Kingdom would place the Mosquito Coast under its colonial rule, but they weren't able to formalize this status until as late as 1740. And that's pretty late. So the administrative divisions of Honduras today, if you look at it, has 18 different departments, and you can see all of these. I won't bother listing them. There are a few, of course, that have more population than the others, and all of this has been distorted by plantation agriculture by imperialist owners like United Fruit Company or Chiquita brands. Spanish Honduras became independent from Spain in 1821. Now, we've gone over this again, but let me do it one more time. The Napoleonic Wars had unseated the Bourbon regime in Madrid, and Napoleon Bonaparte had placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Madrid throne. That set up a civil war in Spain, which the loyalists lost quickly to the Bonapartists, and they managed, however, to hold on to a Cadiz and to parts of Portugal until they were overwhelmed by Napoleon's massive armies. But in Spain, they fought a civil war for long enough for the inherent weaknesses of the Napoleonic armed control of Europe to bring about its disintegration. The final defeat by the Russians of Napoleon's army led to the collapse of the Napoleonic regime and the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Now, after that, people had been fighting for the loyalist forces in Spain, began to return home to their Latin American countries. And as they did, they came with the ideology that they had acquired of the Bonapartists, of liberty, equality, fraternity, and of course from North America, that is from the United States, which had successfully thrown off British rule. At that time, Britain was the most powerful country in the capitalist world. So they are thinking to themselves universally, we don't need this Spanish imperial status anymore. The North Americans have proven they can do perfectly well without imperialists being part of an empire, and we can do the same thing. And so in Spanish Honduras, in 1821, they became independent from Spain. Now, in the first part of that, they were a part of the first Mexican Empire. that was created in Mexico as the first breakaway from Spain up there. But this was occurring throughout Latin America. In 1823, this first American empire disintegrated, and Honduras became part of the United Provinces of Central America Federation. And then after 1388, Honduras became an independent republic and held regular elections. Comayagua was the capital of the Republic of Honduras until 1880, and that capital was then moved to Tegucigalpa, where it is today. In the decades of 1840 and 1850, Honduras participated in several failed attempts to restore Central American unity. This unity movement continues right up to the present day. That is, there are many people in of the educated class, at least in the Central American countries, who have been thinking since 1821 that it would be a good idea for the Central American countries to be part of one nation. And initially they called this the Confederation of Central America, but it only lasted for 3 years, from 1842 to 1845. It evolved into the Covenant of Guatemala in 1842. In turn came the Diet of Sonsonate in 1846, then the Diet of Nacome in 1847, and finally the National Representation in Central America Government of 1849 to 1852. Although Spanish Honduras eventually adopted the name Republic of Honduras, the unionist ideal, as I say, never waned, and Republican Honduras was one of the Central American countries that pushed hardest the policy of regional unity. Since independence, nearly 300 small internal rebellions and civil wars have occurred in Honduras, including some changes of government. And of course the most recent ones in the 20th century and the 21st century have been as a result of U.S. CIA direct intervention. Imperialism entered formally, shaping modern Honduras in the 1870s, when today's neoliberal policies in international trade and capital investment and forced non-union labor began as what were then called, that is in the 1870s, liberal policies. Soon, U.S. corporations took over the domestic shipping industry. By the way, that's why we have this term neoliberal. Originally, this form of capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, was called liberal, and now in its reborn form it's called neoliberal. What it is just an outright rape and pillage form of capitalism. Soon, U.S. corporations took over the domestic shipping industry in order to get the United Fruit Company's Chiquita Brands International business in the shipping of tropical fruit, most notably bananas, to North America. Shipping was done from the Honduran north coast. Now, these fruit shipments were originating, as time went on, not from small farmers in Honduras or anywhere else in Central America, but from slave labor-run plantations in the interior of the country. Therefore, for the same reason, that is fruit shipping from United Fruit Company, Chiquita Brands, and their compradors, latifundia estates in the interior, U.S. capitalists began railway building, and in 1888, a projected railroad line from the Caribbean coast to the capital city of Tegucigalpa ran out of money when it reached the San Pedro Sula. Now, this temporary stoppage resulted in San Pedro Sula's growth into the nation's biggest industrial center and second largest city. The fact that just stopping railroad construction for a few years could have such a boom effect shows you how much U.S. imperialism had impacted Honduras, because this meant that a huge amount of capital was flowing into the country in order to construct a city this big and an industrial center, and a tremendous amount of, because this labor is dirt cheap. You're paying less than $1 a day for all of these workers who are working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days at least a week, and no social benefits whatsoever. So it's all turning into surplus value appropriated by profit by these international capitalists, and of course there's plenty left over to pay their local comprador flunkies. And that city, San Pedro Sula, if you've ever been there, if you haven't, if you go to Tegucigalpa, you want to go to San Pedro Sula, because there you will see just how fast imperialism can impact the country and build something as big as that place is today. Well, anyway, the Honduran economy today, the economic growth in the last few years has averaged 7% a year, one of the highest rates in Latin America. That is of 2010. However, in that same year, 50% of the Honduran population had been pressed by their U.S. corporate masters below the poverty line. And in 2015, more than 1.2 million people unemployed thanks to the U.S. coup regime's neoliberal policies. So when they talk about 7% economic growth a year, you want to keep in mind that the cost of this has been the impoverishment of millions of people who at least used to be able to feed themselves, and can't even do that anymore. As always, capitalism strives for the cheapest form of labor, whether it's Hitler's concentration camps or the U.S. latifundias run in places like Guatemala, Honduras and Guatemala. At any rate, according to the Human Development Index, Honduras is the poorest and least developed country in Latin America after Haiti and Guatemala. And that's saying a lot. I think most of you know how poverty-stricken Haiti is. Honduras, according to them, is even worse off. Honduras was declared one of the heavily indebted poor countries by the imperialist financial organs themselves, that is, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the worst parasitical organizations in the history of the capitalist world. The U.S. puppet government operates both the electricity, ENEE, and landline telephone services, Hondutel. Corruption entitles ENEE bureaucrats to giant subsidies for its never-ending bottomless pit of financial problems. In other words, all the money that the government puts into Hondutel is immediately stolen by the generals that run it. Hondutel was simply raped and turned over to private U.S. telecommunication capitalists on the 25th of December 2005, and of course they hire local thugs that like to call themselves generals in order to make all of the workers there work for essentially nothing. This part of the regional rape known as CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. Exactly like NAFTA, another one of these rape the workers, give all the money to the capitalist programs. The price of petroleum is determined by the government and the oil monopolies, with the imperialists bought and paid for Congress occasionally bothering to ratify price regulations for bases such as oil and other commodities. Gold, silver, lead, zinc are mined, again by de facto slave labor by big U.S. corporations. The Honduran lempira is the currency. And as usual, of course, this is pegged to the dollar. In 2005, Honduras signed the CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, with the U.S., and in December 2005, Puerto Cortes, the main seaport in Honduras, was included in the U.S. Container Security Initiative, which is pretty much what you might guess it is, a way by which the U.S. Homeland Security Department and its Department of Energy announced the first phase of the way they were going to control foreign ports. An unprecedented effort to build upon existing port security measures by enhancing the U.S. government's authority to scan containers from overseas for nuclear and radiological materials to better assess the risk of nuclear detection. And of course the real purpose for all of this has been to eliminate all the small businessmen and hand the business just to a few huge U.S. container corporations. The initial phase of secure freight involves the deployment of nuclear detection to 6 foreign ports, one of which, Puerto Cortes, is in Honduras. Another is in Pakistan, another in the United Kingdom, another in Oman, another in Singapore, and finally one in Korea. Since early 2007, containers from these ports have been scanned for radiation and other risk factors before they are allowed to depart for the United States, which means that only a few corporations, U.S. of course, are allowed to put these big containers on ships that are then allowed into the United States. In 2012, the Honduras government signed a memorandum of understanding with a group of international investors to build, get this, a tax and labor law exempt city within the country of Honduras. Now this city would have its own special laws, tax system, judiciary, and police. Now, patriotic opponents of this have lodged a suit in Honduras with the Supreme Court there, declaring the agreement to be tantamount to creating a state within a state. This is just a localized version of the super secret TTIP conspiracy of multinational corporations against local labor and environmental laws. Just their whole idea is to get rid of all U.S. labor law and environmental law and that of any other country which interferes with what the corporations want to do. This exempt city is just the local Honduras proposal for a local Honduran exempt city, and manifestation of the same philosophy, of the same neoliberal philosophy of rape and pillage that this TTIP thing they're trying to put together in secret is supposed to do for them worldwide. About half of the electricity sector in Honduras is privately owned, and the remaining generation capacity is run by the totally corrupt ENEE, Empresa Nacional de Energía Eléctrica. Key challenges in this sector are, well, I'm not going to go over those, but there are how to finance different kinds of investments, how to arrange for tariffs, how to handle environmental concerns, which means how to ditch environmental concerns, and how to build roads into more rural areas so that you can get your hands on more cheap labor. In terms of transport, infrastructure for transportation, it consists of 700 kilometers of railways, 14,000 kilometers of roadway, 7 ports and harbors, 112 airports, and so on and so forth. Water supply and sanitation in Honduras varies greatly, from the urban centers to the rural villages, and large population centers generally have modernized water treatment, and the rural areas do not. Many urban areas have sewer systems in place for the collection of wastewater, but proper treatment of wastewater is almost non-existent. In rural areas, sanitary facilities are generally limited to latrines and basic septic pits. Water and sanitation services were originally provided by an outfit called SANAA. In 2003, a new water law was passed privatizing water services, the same kind of neoliberal crap that the U.S., USAID, and the rest of them try and impose everywhere that they possibly can. I'm going to skip over the rest of the demographics. It's not all that important. 90% of the population is mixed European and American Indian of one kind or another. The languages, as I say, they're Spanish, Pidgin Spanish, Garifuna, Bay Island Creole English, Mosquito, Sumu, Pech, Hikake, Chorti, Lenca. These are all indigenous peoples with their own religion, their own language, and their religions. I'm going to skip over all of that too, so that we can get up to some of the more modern period of time and try to finish this particular lecture. Crime, as I mentioned to begin with, in Honduras is a murder rate of over 90.4 per 100,000 population. That is, in 2012 there were 7,172 murders. Since the U.S. coup in Honduras has become the most dangerous country in the world in terms of its murder rate. The biggest business there, of course, is drug trafficking, after which we have the United Fruit Company and so on. There's some interesting story I'm not going to go over here in Wikipedia for those of you that are interested in the Honduran drug business, where a guy talks about his personal experiences there, and they pretty much correlate with what I know about that business and that part of the world. What happens is you buy this stuff, and they say the cocaine in Colombia for $2,000 a kilo, and you sell it to wholesalers in Honduras for $7,000 a kilo. You can carry about 4,500 kilos per flight, so we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in every one of these flights. When you have that kind of money flowing, everybody's on the drug kingpin's payrolls, and there's no such thing as an honest cop. At any rate, we can skip over that too, except to point out that the narcos have paved the way for corporate investment in the Mosquito, that is the Mosquito Indian region. In many ways, the current U.S. puppet Lobo administration could not have engineered a more effective process for quickly and quietly converting biodiverse indigenous commons into ecologically simplified private holdings open for business. Narco-trafficking has, after all, been astonishingly efficient at weakening once powerful indigenous political coalitions, which is another way of saying that if your original political coalition was based upon how you were exploiting the local farmers, then you can imagine that the introduction of hundreds of millions of dollars on a daily to monthly basis by airplanes has completely distorted that relationship, and people now get into this from the standpoint of providing airstrips, providing airplanes, providing supplies for all of this business, providing protection, of course. And at any rate, the narco-led forest-to-pasture conversion has created a booming, if entirely illegal, land market, attracting outside criminal investors. Further, the presence of traffickers justifies militarized intervention in the region. According to the native indigenous peoples, the military presence is used as much to secure the interests of the indigenous capitalists as it is to deter any traffickers. And I can see that we're running out of time here, so we're going to have to finish up this lecture on Honduras in the next one, lecture 32, where we're going to continue into El Salvador. If you think everything is bad in Honduras as it is, and it is bad, wait until you get to El Salvador and the reign of Blowtorch Bob and his gang, who have been running things down there for quite a long time.